Thank you so much for inviting us, and also on behalf of Rachel, of course, warm thanks to the Schöne Gesellschaft for this beautiful chance to tell all of you about our work here. Yes. The lecture is structured in 3 parts. I am going to be the more practical one today. I'm going to tell you about the 2 projects which I set up, of course, with many other people, women of the Rijksmuseum, and I will discuss the mission, methods, and milestones. And then we go over to the other half, which is a museum exchange platform, which Rachel and I, with others, set up. And then Rachel will delve into research, which is, of course, the goal of all these projects, with her study of Ida C. Pelen. So the project Women of the Rijksmuseum started off in 2021 with a sort of symbolic gesture. I don't know how many of you know the Rijksmuseum's interior, but we are in the form of a church, more or less, and the central nave is called the Gallery of Honor. And that building dates from 1885, and since 1885 there was never a woman shown in the Gallery of Honor, where all the big names of the 17th century are present. So think Vermeer, think Rembrandt, think Frans Hals, but don't think Judith Leyster, don't think Rachel Ruijs, or Gesine ter Borch. So we decided, as a kind of symbolic gesture, to start with showing at least 3 works by women in the Gallery of Honor from March 8, 21. And I can tell you it's a very hard thing to keep up, especially since women artists are now so popular that they are continuously asked for loans. So now these works are all over the world, but not in the Gallery of Honor. So that's quite a struggle. And of course, if we only did that, that would be tokenism. That would be just a gesture and nothing more. So what we did from the 21st of March, but it actually started a little bit earlier, is formulate a project of research. Because everything which we do in the Rijksmuseum is based on research, whether it's an exhibition, a podcast, or a new presentation. And of course, a research program needs a good question, and we formulate it rather broadly, as you can see. The main inquiry is, what traces have women left in Dutch history, and how are these manifested in the Rijksmuseum collections and the history we represent? So note, this project is not about women's art history or women's history in general. It's a collection-based, focused project, because we have a big catch-up to do. It really all started in 2018 when a female journalist asked all the Dutch museums around about March 8, how many female artists do you represent? And we didn't know. Now, we do have more than 1 million of objects, so it is quite a hard thing to task, but still, we were very much aware that we had some catching up to do. So that is what the project is very much about. The institutional framework, and Sophia has already alluded a little bit to that, is of course the current discussions. How do we make our museum relevant in the age in which we live? And especially in the many changes which have occurred during the last, say, 10 years in the museum world and in the world in general. The Rijksmuseum reopened after a big renovation in 2013. So now, in 2023, our permanent presentation is 10 years old. That, too, makes for rethinking of what we're doing. And you might have heard of the slavery exhibition, which we organized in 2021. In 2022, we had a huge exhibition on the independence battle of Indonesia, so a colonial story. And the Women in the Rijksmuseum project is very much part of that whole picture. It's a laboratory for the years to come, how we're going to change the permanent collection. So that's the institutional framework, which aims at the museum itself, more diversity in personnel as well, collection, presentation, and research. And then there is an ambition to give a more balanced perspective, especially on the level of gender, but not only that, and of the whole. The thing is that we aim to get to be superfluous in 2026. So then our work should be done. I don't believe that actually, but still, you have to make a goal somewhere. So how are we going to do it? We're focusing on 3 pillars of research. One of those is makers. We do not use the word artist because we think that is a very romantic 19th century concept and also very restrictive when you're talking about art of the Middle Ages, for instance. But we use the word maker. So we need more female makers, so that's acquisition, and we need to make our collection database up to date because we do not use the tag female or male at the moment consistently, and that's very important to know what you're having. The second pillar is stories. We are, apart from a big art museum, we are also a history museum. We represent the history of the Netherlands. So we need stories to tell in the museum, and there we are also looking for a more gendered perspective. And then there is the third pillar, which is about our collection builders. Who were the people who made the Rijksmuseum what it now is, especially women? How did women contribute to the Rijksmuseum, from volunteer to director? And who were our female donors and what did they give? That is part of the project of which I'm going to speak later, the other half. And I find this very interesting to also point out there is no emancipation movement without financial backing. That turns out to be very important, also because the museum is, of course, an open to the public, so our work is immediately seen by our visitors and therefore needs to be in order, historical-wise, but also, you know, in design and everything. So we managed to get, and you see them here below, a great group of people together who are backing us up. And I find that important not just for financial reasons, but also because of the social movement which it shows. It's an emancipation movement which is carried now by big CEOs of bankers, by internet pioneers. You see also the name of Chanel there, who has, of course, the Chanel Culture Fund. So it's a big family in a way, and it's very important to know that it's not only in the art world that you're changing, but in the whole world. And this, all these points which are above there are what we are trying to do with this funding. And then the milestones. What exactly is happening in those 5 years? And what is happening I will show you later, but it's all based on these things which I've written down on the lower half of the slide. Research, like I said, get your collection database, get your information in order. That's very important. Biographical information, who are the women which you are studying, and in-depth case studies, of which Rachel will tell one later. And we find it also very important to use the new ideas and the fresh wind of young curators, students, interns to do all this research, because they are not burdened like I am with all this old history. The debate is very important. We organize a symposium every year around March 8th. The next one is coming up. And then the presentation. So a museum cannot just publish in academic journals. We need to reach out. So the outreach is very important for what we're doing. And that is a little bit of the ideas we're having, which are going to happen. The big milestones, of course, there will be a lot in between. We're not necessarily focusing on an exhibition of a big female painter, for instance. There is no Artemisia Gentileschi or whoever, Frida Kahlo, in our museum planned at the moment, because we focus on ourselves, because we think it's more worthwhile, one thing, to get our act together, basically. And also, we also find that giving women constantly the position of exception is not necessarily a good thing for the integration of female art history. So therefore, we prefer to look at an integrated approach. And one of the examples, for instance, is the exhibition which we are preparing for 2025, the 17th Century Home, which focuses on the decorative arts in the 17th century. And of course, that theme immediately opens up the field to women in the home. The same thing is the summer exhibition of next year, which is a collection database in which we go and look at what about gender, masculinity, femininity in our own collection. Is this a set given thing, or do we see changes, fluidity, etc.? So that is a way of doing it. You also see that the color becomes faded, which means that we slowly fade out because we will have achieved our goal, I hope. This is a quick turnover, but I will send the save the date to Andrea, and maybe she can send it around, of the upcoming symposium, of which I'm very happy that we have been able to ask curators all over the world to talk about their exhibitions, and also some very interesting keynotes. So, acquisition. I'll show you here 4 paintings, but of course we are a museum of paintings, of decorative art, of sculpture, of jewels, everything. But I want to show with this slide 2 things. One is that we have a time span from the Middle Ages until the 20th century, basically until now. And of course, it's far easier to find women artists in the 19th and 20th century because of the way history was than in the Middle Ages. Yet, already in 1894, we were donated the beautiful little portrait by Catharina van Hemesse, which was shown only shortly, and then it was deemed in a too bad condition, and therefore was stowed away into the depot until 2021, believe it or not, when we found finally the funds to restore it. And now it's very important because it's the first signed and dated portrait in the Netherlands of in art history, basically, because she wrote on it, Catharina van Hemesse, Pinkzit, 1548. So that for me is very important. So we try to do the whole period which we show, but also we look at what we have. And this was in the depot. So we bring back works which have for some reason or not been neglected during the decennia, basically, the decades. I was saying already, we focus on the term maker and not so much artist. And that is because of the scope of the collection, but also art history is more a story of makers than necessarily artists. And here is a nice example. This is the widow Brandjes, who in about 1893 was left from her husband, who died, a tile factory in Purmerend in the north of Amsterdam. And she made this tile factory into a very successful pottery, which had a big name in Art Nouveau pottery, as you see here. You also see that it didn't last very long. It was a production years of about 10 years, so it's pretty rare pottery. And in this case, her role needs to be defined. She's not the maker, she's not the painter, but she's the one in charge. She's the one who decided, you could say she was the CEO of this pottery. So that's very important, why you need to define the role of what people do and take them into the whole story. This applies even more to works on paper. I said we have a collection of about more than 1 million objects. Almost half of that is our collection of works on paper. So drawings, pastels, and prints and photographs. I show you here on the left, right, but for me it's the right, a drawing by Gesina Terborg, which is of course a single-handed work, but underneath, you cannot read it, I know, but there is a laudatio, so a poem to honor her by a very famous poet of the 17th century. So she was very well known, and together this leaf is now, of course, a composite artwork. even better explains the differences of roles is the print, the engraving by Maria de Wilde from the 18th century. Maria de Wilde designed this, so she drew, she then engraved it, and she published the work of herself and of her father. So she has 3 roles in one, and especially with prints, you need all these roles. Usually there are more people involved, sometimes it's just one person. And I also brought in this photograph by Eva Watson-Schütze, while I want to point out that our collection is not just Dutch-based, it's of course international. So the second pillar is about stories. And that's very important to know, that the stories you find, and I will give some examples of that, are usually not the one which you find in the textbook. Because as you all know, women have not really played a big role in our textbook, which we have all grown up with, and many of you are still reading at the time. So it's necessary to reframe history, to think anew, and not just rely on what you read, but ask new questions. And that will lead to new stories and a new history or historiography. And this is a beautiful example of this. This is a 17th century painting of a couple which was always noted down as a kind of exemplary love because they're sitting hand in hand. So really a quite cute couple. If you look carefully, however, trained as you all are in iconography, you do not find one attribute which points to love. Instead, around them, you see attributes which point to printing and to bookmaking. Abraham Kastelein was a very important printer, the son of a printing family, and took over the business of his mother. In Haarlem, they were the producers of the first paper in the Netherlands. And when he died, as was the custom in the Netherlands, his widow was allowed to take over. So she did, Margaretha van Banken. And when she remarried, she still kept the business of the printing firm in her hands. She did not rely on the name of her then husband. And when she died, her family took over, among which several daughters. So there is a definite feminine line there, but it's also a partnership. And there are many more of these kind of stories which we are now undelving, because we do not think necessarily of the women only in this 19th century concept of the wife of, the woman at home, looking at the house and looking at the kids. And we even we did a bachelor's seminar on that with the University of Amsterdam under the guidance of Judith Norman, and we call that seminar The Wife Of. And we have in the Rijksmuseum many portraits, which we call pendant portraits, so you have 2 of them, the man and the woman. And very often we know the name and the function or the role or the position of the man, and the female portrait, if we have a name, very often we don't even have a name, is invariably called the wife of the man. And then her text, her object label, is about the dress and the pearls and how beautiful she looks and how soft her skin is, etc. So we asked these students, look into these wives, what did they do? Because this Aert van Nest, the Lieutenant Admiral, he was of the Marine of the Netherlands, of the Navy. And of course, in a time of war, which the 17th century was, these men were from home, sometimes 7 years. So what did she do all the time? Well, if we compare it with what other admirals' wives did, she actually fitted out the ships. She hired the new personnel to send after the fleet. And then, if you then start looking beyond the pearls and the beautiful dress, which I can't deny she's wearing, you find that in the background, she points to a very calm sea, a ship that has been just fitted out and people waving goodbye. So the ship is going to leave and join the army's fleet or the navy's fleet of her husband, where in his background you see, of course, the war and the storm and difficult times. So this means that Geertruide den Dubbele was able to budgetize, to read, to hire people. So we're looking at educated people here. Of course, it's the higher group or the elite group of the 17th century society, but nevertheless, she was more than the wife of, she again was the partner of the Lieutenant Admiral. And there are many more stories like these. If you want to write new label text, which we are now doing for the symposium in March, I want with the people, the participants of the symposium, to go and look in the galleries at our new female narrative in our object labels. It's very important to think about your tone of voice. And we encountered that when we did the exhibition Women on Paper, which was the result of the first inventory of our collection database in the print room. And we noticed that when you indeed rely on the existing literature, you get a very clear-cut, recognizable historic discourse on female artists. And I show you two examples. This was the first text, which was written based on literature, so it's a correct text. And I call it the victim-heroine discourse. It's about this beautiful portrait by Betsy Oziek. We will encounter her later again. And what it reads, it says, coming from a well-to-do background, being an artist was not necessary to Betsy Westendorp Oziek's livelihood. Nevertheless, she took her craft extremely seriously. This is what happens in all these texts. However, yet, at first she's the victim, her upbringing, her social class doesn't allow her to be an artist, yet she fights and she becomes a heroine. When you read 15 of these texts in one gallery, you get pretty bored, for one thing. And the other thing is that the idea that women are exceptions in art history is, of course, internalized. So we looked at what we do with other objects of art, and of course it's about the art, it's about the artwork. We're a museum, we're not into biographical text, which is very often happening with women. So this is the text which ended up in the exhibition, and there you see, for one thing, that we call Betsy with her maiden name because she wasn't even married when she painted this, and that we treat the portrait as a portrait and look at what we see. And another example is maybe even funnier in a way. This I call the blind spots. This is about a fairly unknown artist, Frederica Broeksmit, so there was some difficulty in finding something about her. And then the text which turned up actually mentions her teacher even more than she herself. And you see that it is a very negative beginning of this text about her work, and it doesn't really is about the artwork. Well, when you start looking properly at the artwork, of course, you will know in the 1890s, there was a huge revival of Rembrandt prints. They were photographed, they were available then for young artists. So clearly, this is a very Rembrandtesque print. So that is what we set out to write about. So this art historical discourse is something you really need to be aware of, and don't, well, I won't say be lazy, but don't too easily take into the stories which have already been told, because they are very much framed. We have to find a new frame because we're asking new questions. Then the third pillar, the collection builders, as I call them. Another word we like to use is matronage, and in this case it's very apt, because this is a painting by Marie Bashkirtsev, Ukrainian, Russian, French artist, very global artist, who the picture of the painting was donated to the Rijksmuseum in 1902, 7 years after Marie Bashkirtsev died very young of tuberculosis. And her mother was very active to promote her daughter's work in several museums in Europe, especially in Russia, France, and the Netherlands. She gave these works so that her daughter's name would live on forever. And it was donated in 1902. It hung until 1916. Then the nationalistic point of view in the Rijksmuseum at that time, very much there, made it difficult for a French artist, a woman artist, to be shown. So she disappeared into the depot until we unearthed the painting in 2022. Now it's one of the most popular paintings in the museum because it's a lovely thing. But also it's very important that this mother was the great champion of her daughter. But that's of course a special case. What we find far more often is that we have a big part of our collection of female artists is donated or left by the artists themselves, because they had to promote their own legacy, very literally so. And this is a beautiful example. This is Bramine Hubrecht with a beautiful pastel portrait, which she painted in 1875. She died in 1913 and left to the Rijksmuseum a huge collection of sketchbooks, of drawings, of paintings, and a few engravings. And of course, in the hope that now she would become an artist in the wealth of the Rijksmuseum collection. What happened, and I find that really sad, is that her family in the 1970s or so asked for a couple of these paintings back for their family foundation. So now this portrait is hanging with the family. And I always say she was out there, she lived a professional, autonomous life, and now she has to live with her parents again. I mean, how bad is that? So we're trying to get her back, obviously, because it's a loan from us. It's a painting of the Rijksmuseum. But her name was never therefore really, never had any acclaim. We bought the beautiful watercolor, which you see here, of Taormina. You see the Etna on the left. In the 1970s, so there was some idea that this was an important artist, but only just now, on November 1st, I've been able to hire a scholar, a young scholar who is very interested, has already published on her, is going to give her the position she has and explore her network, explore her professionalism, her travels, etc. So that is really something which the project made possible. Of course, collection builders, many of those are collectors who donate their collection to the museum. And one of those is Betsy Wessendorp-Oziek. You already saw her portrait in a couple of slides back. And she was, apart from being an artist, she was also a collector. And she left a huge legacy together with her husband, but he died 20 years earlier. So she was the one who finalized the legacy. And they assembled a huge collection of Asian artifacts. They went over there, traveled a lot. And here you see two of these beautiful statues, funerary statues, which are on show in the Rijksmuseum. And she donated these to the Royal Society of Friends of Asian Art, and that collection in total is in the Rijksmuseum. So it's a bit of a one handshake away, but it's still part of our collection. But it turned out that Betsy Oziek also had a big contemporary at the time, so 1900, 1920s, paintings collection. That ended up in the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. Her costume collection ended up in the Hague Museum. So this is a different way of collecting, and we find that more often that women distributed their collections to several museums in the Netherlands, and therefore being equal to everybody, like your children, you know, everybody's same sweets. But it's a new way of collecting. We're not quite sure whether that is a pattern yet. We have to know more about that. But we know this because of the other half. So I'm now coming into that other project which we set up. The other half focuses on women in the Dutch art world who are not makers. So we're talking about collectors, we're talking about museum workers, critics, gallery owners, patrons. All these people make up the art world too. So at the period we chose is 70-80 because that was the first museum in the Netherlands, Tylers Museum in Haarlem. And in the 1980s, women were accepted in the museum world. We had female museum directors, so we thought that would be a good point to stop. And here, this is on the website of the RKD, the Netherlandish Institute for Art History in The Hague, where the platform is hosted. And there you see a couple of these women who were important in the Dutch art world. Nelly van Doesburg, the wife of Theo van Doesburg. Ooh, there I go, the wife of... But anyway, she was a very important collector, exhibition maker, and artist herself. Til Brugman, who was a very important patron of Mondriaan, and Maria Schoenmakers, who was a very important collector. the other half was set up by 4 of the institutions which you see up, and basically Rachel, I, and 2 other curators, we set it up. And we managed to get many museums active as participants, looking into their own archives, who are our female donors, who are our female protagonists in the institutional history, because that's what it's all about. And we also work together with other institutions outside, and I even put the Technische Universität there because I think this is a good moment. But so you see that by working together, you learn a lot. And something like the fact that women collectors distributed their collections among several museums is one of the results of this cooperation. So it's very important to do that. It's slow work. Not every curator has the time to delve into the archive, to look into the sometimes invisible women, because of course the men sign the contracts and not the women, but we're getting there, so that's really important. So here are a couple of these collectors. It is Marie Tak van Poortvliet, who again distributed her very important early 20th century collection of paintings to, amongst others, the Museum Boijmans and the Mondriaan, here to the Nationalgalerie in Berlin. And of course, there were also women who founded their own museums. Like Jo van Gogh Bonger, she didn't found a museum, but her work led to the foundation of the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. Helene Krüller-Müller made the famous Krüller-Müller Museum in Otterlo, and Anna Singer even founded 2 museums, one in her home place in the United States, and the other one in Laren in the middle of the Netherlands. I find it telling that all 3 of these women only had their first biography in the recent 6 years or so. That's really something which we have to work on. But it's happening, that's important. Apart from the museum donors, we also have, of course, the museum workers. Rachel will go into that, but I show you 2 of them because it was a special wish of our directors that we not only look into female art history, but also in our own institutional history. So one of our researchers, Marion Anke, has now published an article on the Rijksmuseum in the Second World War, when, of course, the whole collection needed to be brought into safety. And Marjorie Bottenheim and Kitty Zettels at that time were the women who made sure that the library and the collection of the print rooms was out of the hands of the occupations. So they more or less run the museum at that time, especially Kitty Zettels, who was the secretary of the directors, and Marjorie Bottenheim, who in the end, because she was Jewish, had to flee herself, but they were very important in the history of our museum. And that story again is told for the first time. So that brings me smoothly to Rachel's lecture, but I want to say that this kind of research, which is now going on, is so important not only for museology in a wider sense, it's important for institutional history, and of course it's important for our knowledge of the art world and the role women played in that. So I now give the floor to Rachel, who is going to present a case study in which you see the results of that kind of research. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Jenny, for introducing the project, Women of the Rijksmuseum. And I'm going to, as you said, go into a case study. And my case study is Miss Ida C.E. Palin, who was the first female director of a national museum. And you'll see soon which national museum that was, not the Rijksmuseum. In 1987, sociologist Arlene Kaplan-Daniels published an article entitled Invisible Work, describing how our understanding of work focuses on activities that are paid. Women's labor, she argued, is devalued as it is often under or unpaid, whether that's on the job or in the home. This idea thus leads to all kinds of work that's done by women disappearing. For example, work involved in the social construction of daily life, and crucially for the context of this lecture, the maintenance and development of institutions. Daniels proposes an expansion of the concept of labor to include many activities previously considered, considered or not previously considered, positing that a keener awareness of the work involved in social maintenance and supportive functions serves to engender respect for the people who do them. And I might just mention the two women figures who Jenny mentioned last, who of course had supportive functions within the museum, but were absolutely essential to the rescuing of the collection during the Second World War. Today, the most invisible personnel work in the care sector, broadly defined. The neoliberal focus on individuality and autonomy has had an enormous impact on labor that has care at its core. And here too, women bear the brunt, as the kinds of labor they do are disproportionately in those sectors in which caring is paramount. And I would argue that that, of course, includes the curatorial sector. My research within the project that Jenny Reynaerts has outlined aims to bring the hitherto invisible contribution of the female workers of the Rijksmuseum in the period before 1960 to light. And aside from the practical problems I've encountered, for example, many women worked in the beginning period, in the early period, as so-called volontaires. This is a word that you all know very well, and have therefore left no administrative records. So that's one problem, but there are also conceptual problems as well. And two that I think are particularly fundamental have to do with, first, how we define curating in general, and also the role that art history has played in how museums are organized and consequently the value that they place on certain types of artifacts. So since the establishment of the discipline and its institutionalization in the 19th century, art history has, of course, always put painting at the top of the pyramid of objects of study. And museums also followed suit. Other kinds of objects are relegated to the lower rungs on the institutional ladder. And these domains, which encompass the decorative arts, textiles, fashion, and costume, have often fallen under the purview of female laborers, considered good enough to care for these minor collections. And because these departments have been considered of lesser significance, of course, they offered, in a sense, women greater opportunity. But this has meant that the women have not gotten the credit they deserve for their contributions. So that's the question of art history getting in the way, maybe, of how we think or how we can make women's labor available. But we also have the problem of the definition of curating. Since the mid-20th century, curating has been associated with exhibition making, and many of the curator's tasks have been delegated to other kinds of professionals. So think about people who manage storage, people who make catalogs, keep track of all the objects in the collection. Traditionally, however, the curator's job was to care for the collection and included work such as documentation, cataloging, research, and writing for a field of specialization. These tasks, too, were often delegated to women, without, however, honoring them with the proper job title. To make women's labor in the museum visible and to better understand its nature, we need to return to the original definition of curating as a form of care and refocus on the aspects of museum work that have been undervalued. The moment we flip the art historical hierarchy and recenter the concept of curating as a form of care, women's work emerges from the shadows. In the early 20th century, the Rijksmuseum was still an institution in the process of becoming. In fact, it wasn't even one institution at all, but was made up of several museums, among them the so-called Dutch Museum for History and Art, which proved to be a breeding ground for female talent in the period between 1906 and 1920. This collection of applied art and historical artifacts had been amassed with the aim of preserving and documenting all aspects of Netherlandish life and cultural production, and was therefore correspondingly diverse in both content and quality. As its director, Adrian Pitt, put it, it was little more than an assemblage of historical junk. As elsewhere in Europe in this period, Dutch museums were in the process of transformation, moving away from a documentary approach to collecting and display and towards a more aesthetic and art historically informed concept of the museum. And Pitt was a forerunner of this movement, which culminated in the early 1920s with the unification of the Rijksmuseum and the Rijksmuseum collections and an entirely new display that separated art from historical artifacts. This is a story that, of course, went on everywhere in Europe in this period. Likewise, and a little bit in contrast to Germany, which had a much longer art historical tradition, the early 20th century was the period in which the first professors of art history were appointed. Willem Vogelsang, who you see here, was given his chair in Utrecht in 1907. Now, the interesting thing about Vogelsang was that he was an advocate of the method of Heinrich Wölfflin. Of course, everyone here knows Wölfflin, who viewed art objects as the result of autonomous artistic and stylistic developments and promoted formal analysis as the best means of understanding them. And it was into this convergence of museum reform and the establishment of the discipline. Sorry, I have to take this thing off. It's annoying me too much. Really distracting. And it was into this convergence of museum reform and the establishment of the discipline along formalist lines that the woman I would like to offer as a case study, Ida Palin, began her career, taking up her post in the Rijksmuseum as the first female volunteer. Palin worked under Pitt from 1906 to 1912. She had previously followed Vogelsang's lectures in Utrecht, and his short stint at the Rijksmuseum, he also worked there for a brief period, coincided with her early years. And under these circumstances, that's at least my thesis, Palin's time in the Rijksmuseum would prove formative for her thinking and her curatorial practices. Uh-oh. Right, pressed the wrong one. Pitt was the director. Adrian Pitt had become director of the Museum for Art and History in 1898. And his approach was informed from the very beginning, by art rather than cultural history. Remember his statement about his collection being mostly junk. And he immediately set about reinstalling the museum to reflect the stylistic developments of the decorative arts and sculpture in the collection. His emphasis lay on quality and authenticity, and he purchased only examples of the highest quality, of the highest artistic quality, whether Dutch or foreign. In addition, he initiated the cataloging of the various collections under his purview, and he enlisted the help of Vogelsang, who completed the first catalog of the furniture collection in the period 1903 to 1907. Oh, sorry, I keep doing that. This background is important for understanding the work undertaken by Palin during her time in the Rijksmuseum, as well as how it influenced her later career. As a volunteer and without a doctoral degree, Palin was not authorized to carry out scholarly work. Nonetheless, she was essential to Pitt's reform plans. In her first year, she carried out two fundamental tasks in connection with Vogelsang's furniture catalog: the transcription and making press-ready of the object information, and taking photographs of the collection. For the latter, she learned both photography and developing, thereby taking an important step in the professionalization of the care and management of the collection. And much of the work she did in the following years revolved around ceramics, which would become her specialty. During these years, she also published on a diversity of objects, from mangle boards to Italian sculpture. The latter dealt with the collection of Italian works of art collected by Otto Lanz, which had been exhibited in the Rijksmuseum in 1907. And this exhibition itself had played an important part in Pitt's argument for expanding the collection to include masterpieces of foreign art, and had been displayed in a manner highly reminiscent of the installations of Willem van Bode. And much like Bode, Pitt seems to have been interested in providing aesthetic experience, an aesthetic experience designed to form the visitor's taste, educating them through the best examples of a given genre. And there are a lot of connections between Bode and the Netherlands in this period, and also during the real period of museum reform in the Netherlands around 1918, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a while. Palin's time in the Rijksmuseum was a first step in a pioneering career in which these discussions around art history, museums, and aesthetic education would bear fruit in her further practice. In 1912, she was hired as under-director of the Municipal Museum in The Hague, then in 1918 as director of Huis Lambert van Meerten in Delft. She was thus the first woman to become the director of a national, i.e. Rijksmuseum. So Lambert van Meerten was and is a Rijksmuseum, or a national museum. At the time of her appointments, the movement towards museum reform was coming to a head, and Palin contributed to the debates in various ways. 1918 saw the publication of a highly critical report on the then current organization and administration of Dutch museums, followed by the institution of a government reform commission in 1919. Their report, published in 1921, called for the further professionalization of the museum world, particularly in reference to the art historical education of museum staff, and a separation in both organization and presentation of art objects and historical artifacts. Moreover, the report emphasized that the duty of museums was not to simply expand and conserve their collections, but more importantly, to provide aesthetic enjoyment and education for a broader public. In 1912, when Palin began working there, the Municipal Museum in The Hague was in the throes of change, with discussions around the same kind of issues as in Amsterdam. The move away from a more documentarian approach began with the appointment of H.E. van Gelder, who you see here, that same year. He would later realize the modernist building we know today, and in this period was busy promoting art historical training for museum professionals. Under the influence of Alfred Lichtwark, another name which everyone in the room knows, he was also an advocate of the museum as a locus of aesthetic education. And under-director Palin would play an important part in the realization of his plans in this regard, giving guided tours and lectures, preparing and supervising object-oriented lessons in the galleries for school children, as well as leading art appreciation evenings in the winter months. Equally important, however, was her scholarly work. She was tasked with the care for and research into the ceramics collection, and in 1917 she published the complete catalog. The introduction focused on the stylistic development of Delftware, and the objects themselves were arranged according to its different phases. The previous collection catalog, by contrast, had been organized along historical lines, namely by manufacturer. The move to Delft provided Palin the opportunity to further develop her ideas regarding the relationship between the museum and the public, as well as museum research and presentation. As with Van Gelder, Lichtwark's Übung in der Betrachtung von Kunstwerken from 1906 seems to have played an important role. Palin published 2 articles on the book and its application in museum work in 1918 and 1919, respectively, proposing his method be adopted by Dutch museums in order to teach visitors to see. As she writes, the essence of this teaching method is that the work of art is not superficially viewed as an illustration of a lecture on history, but that the work of art an sich is exclusively discussed. For Palin, the aim of art education in the museum was to enable visitors to experience works of art aesthetically. She wrote, "A work of art should not only be considered and judged, but first and foremost experienced, erlebt, as the Germans say, if one wants to feel its great influence." In the first years of her long tenure at the museum, she raised funds for the purchase of a renowned tile collection and acquired ceramic works by international makers, thereby improving the museum's overall quality. Moreover, she inventoried the entire collection and published the museum's first comprehensive guide. She introduced temporary exhibitions, quite a novelty back then, not only on historical but also on contemporary applied art, so even more innovative, I would say, as well as lecture series. Her efforts were recognized in an article published in 1929. Quote, "During the time that Miss Palin has been director of this museum, she has made important changes and improvements. She strives to make the collection fruitful for the public in order to increase their knowledge and to awaken the interest in art of those who may not yet have an eye for it." As for the presentation of the collection, the museum had originally been designed to recreate the atmosphere of a 17th century patrician home, with period rooms made up of authentic pieces, copies, and 19th century neo-style objects and furniture. This seems to have remained largely intact, but I have to say I haven't had a chance yet to really delve into the actual presentation in the museum and what she possibly changed. So it seems that this installation remained largely intact, although there is also some evidence of an aesthetic cleanup. When you compare these two slides, for example, you can see that the 1894 one, there's still the carpet on the ground. In the image from the 1920s, that's no longer there. So getting rid of all of these kind of non-aesthetic period room objects seems to have indeed taken place in at least some of the rooms. The museum guide, however, provided the necessary lessons in taste and appreciation. As noted by Elizabeth Nerdenberg, a friend of Palin's and fellow scholar of ceramics, in a review published in 1923, the guide carefully and consistently pointed out which objects were authentic and directed the visitor's attention to those pieces especially worthy of study. The museum enjoyed newfound popularity under Palin's directorship, attracting large numbers of local and national visitors, as well as scholars from around the world. Her work thus made an important contribution to the study of Dutch and international applied arts in general, and Delft ceramics and tiles in particular. I return now to the question of the curator's remit and women's work in the museum. Palin was interviewed several times during her career. Questions that come up repeatedly in these conversations revolve around exactly what a museum director actually does. And in the case of Palin, I would of course argue that given the small size of the museum and her small staff, she had the role of both director and curator. And another question that came up in all of these interviews is in what ways her work might relate to her gender, and in particular, whether museum work was in some way especially suited to women. One such interview, published already in 1928 in the NRC, the Nieuwe Rotterdamse Courant, under the title, The Day's Work of Museum Director Ida C.E. Palin. An analysis of the article using the so-called verb-oriented method developed by the University of Uppsala in the context of their research project Gender and Work turns up the following tasks for Miss Palin. Study, research, inventory, describe, classify, catalog, arrange, install, educate, be of service to the public, give guided tours, provide information, care for and conserve, repair, restore, and so on, and so on, and so on. Note that the great majority of these tasks fall under the rubric of care and are essential for the social role of the museum. For many of the journalists who interviewed her, and even Palin herself, there was a strong connection between her practices as a director/curator and her gender. While affirming that a prerequisite for the job was specialized study, the female director of a museum is a woman of science, said one reviewer, Kate de Ridder. Kate de Ridder introduces her interview with Palin as follows. But on one important point, the woman, whatever task she takes on, will always distinguish herself from the man. He prefers to work based on knowledge and reason. She will, however, intelligent as she may be, always use two specifically female qualities, her heart and her intuition. There are men who can fulfill their daily duties excellently, but their feelings remain out of the game. For women, with a few exceptions, this is virtually impossible. They put their whole heart, their devoted care into their work. Now, Palin affirms this assessment when she told Mary Poss in 1929, quote, "You ask if my work is actually suitable for a woman. For me, to feel and fathom works of art requires a lot of intuition, and a woman is generally very intuitive. I know of no profession more beautiful and versatile than this, to which one can give oneself with such heart and soul." And she reiterated these notions throughout her career, often additionally emphasizing the amount of devotion, hard work, and sacrifice her position entailed, while nonetheless stressing how much pleasure and satisfaction it provided, in particular because it combined personal development with making a contribution to society. In Palin's eyes, this made museum work perfect for women. As she said to Poss, quote, "There is so much work today, especially for women, that leaves one unsatisfied. But to give oneself to the study of art and to the task of making art public property again is one of the most beautiful things that can be assigned to a woman." And years later, Kate de Ridder would conclude her interview, quote, "The joy with which Miss Palin spoke about her work, the heartfelt satisfaction that her job still gives her after all these years of great effort, prove that also in this direction, an important field of work has been opened up for the working woman." Now, obviously, you're probably all feeling very itchy about all of these statements. It certainly makes me itch. This focus on essential feminine qualities and intrinsic motivation can, of course, be read as a way of veiling the fact that museum work was and is hard work and not very well paid. And it's also striking in these interviews is that Palin almost never mentions her very important scholarly work and her contribution to the history of ceramics. And this is very obvious. These are socially wished-for answers that she's giving because she wants to meet the expectations of a society not yet willing to accept women as scholars. However, I would say that her own somewhat implicit definition of her work as a form of care demonstrates, however, that what we can learn about women and museums when we leave behind the domains of painting and sculpture and the idea that curating is only about exhibition making. Her commitment to the ideals of the museum reform movement is evident, as is her adherence to the notion, propagated by the first generations of art historians, that the discipline should be primarily concerned with the visual, formal, and aesthetic aspect of works of art. Moreover, she was one of the first to actually put these ideals of the museum reform into practice. And all this makes her contribution to the history of the Dutch museum world not just interesting, but actually, I would say, essential. So, thank you very much for your attention.